Okay, so thanks for inviting me to what I hope will be a continuing dialogue with Gen Vic and many of you in the room. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge people with disability who are experiencing violence or who have experienced violence, as their stories and indeed their invisibility is what should inform all of the work and next steps. And just in terms of an evidence base, I was thinking when Star Lady was speaking, all of those US statistics, we really don't have a good evidence base. So it's difficult to build anything from that when we don't have the statistics. And that's pretty much the same for women with disabilities as well. So I'm going to make a confession, not a Catholic confession, but just I started working in the family violence sector when I was 20, and that was over 30 years ago. Back then, if you put on your CV that you had a qualification or a degree, you didn't get an interview, right? You were not, you were looked at with a high degree of suspicion that you were part of some other structure. What you did need was a passion to work collectively. Yes, an actual collective. I don't know if anyone even knows what that is. Surely you do, Indira. And a revolutionary stance, really, on the need to topple the patriarchy and dismantle oppressive systems. So women's stories were what informed our work, as they were the experts in their own lives. And we know that even in the Marram, with risk assessment, that's where all of those risk factors came from, women's stories. And from the women's sector. And I owe a great deal to all the people I've had the privilege to work alongside, victim survivors who've been my teachers and feminist elders that encouraged my incessant questioning. Upon reflection though, I have to ask myself how many of the women I worked with had or identified as having a disability. Sorry about the noise. How many lived in group homes and who was not sitting at the table and why? For those of you who don't know us, the Disability Services Commissioner, the DSC, is the independent statutory body that looks at complaints about regulated disability service providers. Today I'm going to share a case study that speaks to the complexities in our systems, the barriers and the lack of holistic, safe and integrated responses. I'm also going to touch on how this led to a prevention project called Building Safe and Respectful Cultures, and how having people with disability involved as community researchers was key to our prevention work. There is a language warning. I may use words that seem alien or not aligned to what you think I should be saying. So in the disability set, it was quite a shock for me. People didn't use the word violence at all. They used the words abuse, neglect, exploitation. So family violence is out of scope for the Disability Services Commission. So when we think of prevention, it's on a different scale and only part of the disability services system. The entry points into and pathways between different parts of the system are siloed and are often unable to meet the needs of people with disabilities. We received a call from Mary, who told us she'd been assaulted by a support worker within the group home she was living in. She lives with 3 other residents. She's a wheelchair user, she has decision-making capacity and is extremely articulate. Whether you would consider this a family-like relationship or not is hotly contested across the sector. But this is not Mary's main concern. She's actually never read the Family Violence Protection Act. So, and I think that, you know, when we think about that notion of family-like, who actually reads that? Who knows about that? So how do you know how to navigate that system? All Mary knows is that she feels frightened and unsafe. With her consent, the DSC contacted the service provider to explore what was being put in place to ensure her safety. The service provider stated they'd undertaken an internal investigation and that the allegations were not substantiated. I've found all of that sort of language within the disability sector quite challenging. So without speaking to Mary, the service decided the best course of action was to allow the worker to continue to work at the group home, but not directly work with her. So what this actually translated to is when the worker comes on shift, Mary locks herself in her room At these times, she's unable to access food or water in the kitchen, and she can't go to the toilet as she requires assistance with a hoist. We would call this a restrictive practice. So, of course, women with disabilities experience all the same types of violence that other women do, but there are some additional ones, you know, not ashamedly, but that I really didn't know about. Chemical restraint, physical restraint. You know, it's pretty shocking, really. And even though I've always thought the family violence sector is under-resourced, go and visit the disability sector. It is, you know, quite astonishing the levels of abuse and neglect that take place in some of the places that supposedly are there to care for you. And so the DSC, all we can do is offer her some referral options. So Mary decided to go to court and pursue an intervention order. However, on the court date, her application was denied. So these are the issues that it made me think about, and we talked about as a team, that the complaints mechanism and conducting internal investigations did not sufficiently address Mary's safety needs. Mary attended a specialist family violence court. She received no information from court staff on other possible options. She was not approached by the court support service and therefore didn't receive risk assessment, safety planning or relevant support. And I thought to myself, how would a family violence support service respond to Mary in this instance? Would they consider it to be family violence? Would they be able to offer outreach to the group home? Would they know of any other options on how Mary could navigate the service system and still have disability supports provided for? If the assault was seen as criminal and the police were contacted, what options would Mary have had in terms of accommodation or home and immediate supports? This seems to be what the services can be tossing up, Mary's safety over Mary's having somewhere to live. And Mary knows that, and all of the other residents know that as well. Other residents, what about them, who may not have been aware of Mary's situation, are still being exposed to the alleged perpetrator of violence? And what message does this send to them? And how does this affect Mary's view of herself and her own recovery? And it got me questioning, and I actually saw Claire the other day, do the PVAW and family violence sector overall have an understanding of the additional barriers for women with disabilities and how this is addressed in practice? Does an intimate partner or PVAW lens catch the people slipping through the net? And do we think people with disability matter and that they're worthy of our regard? So why look at a prevention project? As the case study demonstrates, people with disability experience violence in a range of contexts, and this has an impact on their basic human rights, help-seeking behaviours and access to services. Over the past few years, there have been a number of state-based and national inquiries into abuse of people with disability. All of these inquiries found that violence is normalised and accepted in the sector and that there is a need for fundamental change to address the issues of violence and abuse. The Building Safe and Respectful Cultures projects wanted to learn more about the culture of services for people with disability. It showed the complex cultures of 3 different disability services and looked at some of the features of those cultures that facilitated feelings of mutual respect and safety, and the converse. And when we're talking about the gender drivers, I obviously think about the fact that we all are sort of marinating in ableism. So this is an everyday experience for people. So as a pilot project, it was modest in scope, and it's really just identified some practical approaches and strategies that might be useful now and relevant for future development. Not having worked in the disability sector before, I was introduced to an initiative called Voice at the Table. Voice at the Table provide training for people with acquired brain injury and intellectual disability to build skills and capacity so they can sit on boards, committees and project advisory groups. I've put together an expression of interest in an accessible format and headed along to see if anyone would be interested. I really didn't think anyone was going to be interested because it was on prevention of violence, abuse and neglect, but over a dozen people turned up and said, of course we would turn up. This is very personal for us. Many of us have experienced violence, abuse and neglect, and many of us have witnessed this. One member sitting around the table having a discussion, Peter Ferguson, said she didn't want to be on the project advisory group, but she was keen to be a researcher. So really what she did is she challenged me, she threw down the gauntlet, and she said, if the disability rights movement mantra, nothing about us without us, means anything to you and the DSC, go and work out ways that people with disability, like me, can be researchers, not always the people being researched. And of course she was right, and I can't thank her enough. And of course I dropped the mic and said, challenge accepted. And so I feel that I just, I happen to be lucky in that the Disability Services Commissioner is winding down, as the NDIS Quality Safeguard Commission will be coming into play on July 1. And so any sort of wacky idea that I had, they were open to, and I feel very grateful for that. So there's no doubt that co-design, collaboration and skill development takes extra time. In the end though, it really saved us time, as community researchers were able to connect with people much more easily through the interview process and the workshops. This is what we need to be thinking about when we challenge systems, involving and empowering people from the ground up. People who are not often visible, who do not have a voice, not because they have nothing to say, simply because they've not been invited to sit at the table. So having community researchers has made us more accountable in the project and at the DSC more broadly. They've challenged the way we do things, the questions in the research, the findings, the best way to share information. And we're invested. So this isn't only a financial investment. We pay for their knowledge and expertise, as we should. It's also a personal and ethical investment. We've enjoyed working together, we've learnt a lot from one another, and we've worked hard for this not to be seen as a tokenistic exercise. I can't tell you much about the research as we're launching our report next week, but this is just a quick sort of preview. We gathered information through interviews, workshops, standalone music workshops, occupational stress data and observation of daily practice. We used the socio-ecological framework well known in the PVOR space to analyse the results. It highlighted what facilitated and hindered safe and respectful cultures, but I think that the most striking finding was how complex these issues all were. There were 4 key themes across the research, and the first one was that people at all levels of the research felt it was very difficult to make change. So at all levels, they feel like they had very little ability to change their situation or to make changes to improve the lives of people with disability. Most of the people involved in the research were alert and wary and almost hypervigilant. Almost everyone was stressed and felt that other people didn't understand what it was like to be in their situation. And this was particularly concerning for us because people with disability have the least power in these scenarios. I've run out of time, so I'm just going to just give you the headings of the titles. So the next thing was that multiple sets of rights need to be brought into view. So there were times when rights collided. All of the services taking part in the study said that they were under pressure to reduce resources and increase efficiency. And people offered ways to prevent violence and abuse before it starts by building safe and respectful cultures. And a lot of it was around prioritising relationships, including a prevention approach in everyday support, reflective practice and supervision for staff, which I think I heard someone say no one gets anymore, which is depressing. And just quickly, I was speaking to a friend and former colleague, and she's lived experience of disability and family violence, and I asked her what were the things she'd like to say, and she said, treat me as a person, irrespective of my disability. We talked about perceptions of risk being underpinned by a range of assumptions about gender, about disability, about what constitutes violence for her. All too often, understandings of resilience are defined in terms of risk and vulnerability, which is problematic for those whose bodies, abilities and levels of functioning are seen to render them vulnerable at risk. And she said, by the way, can services stop calling me vulnerable? We're just about to go through a period where people are thinking of having a vulnerable people's check. Instead of a working with children check, there might be a vulnerable working with vulnerable people check. I'm resilient, ability diverse, functionally diverse and body diverse people navigate their lives with or without the service system. We're sort of used to it. And is disability part of your conversation? If you're not talking about it, you don't see it. It doesn't exist. And I think that if you don't know much about people with disability and the systemic discrimination they face, learn more. If you're doing it right, it should be challenging, it should be stretching you and making you uncomfortable. Sit with the uncomfortable critiques and go with that discomfort. And that's all.